the barbarians who sapped the strength of the Roman Empire? Was it disease? Was it Christianity? Was it taxes that caused its decadence, or was it just another ancient empire that could not adjust when circumstances changed too radically? The decline of Rome, this time on the Western tradition.
It has always been a problem for a society faced by a serious challenge to decide just what measures it can take and how far it can go in opposing and meeting that challenge. If you argue that you can only preserve your way of life by adopting certain means which negate that way of life, that you can only preserve democracy or free speech by limiting them, for example, or preserve a high standard of living by taxing and restricting it, or preserve liberty by regimentation, or moral order by inquisition, then you run the risk of sacrificing exactly the things you say you are fighting for. You run the risk of sacrificing precisely those things that you use to justify the sacrifices in the first place. And you risk becoming so like your enemy that the differences matter very little.
The imperial administration was always concerned with keeping the big city population happy because it was more volatile and prone to riot. So the government offered what the Roman poet Juvenal called bread and circuses. Races, shows, games, displays of every sort, which had once offered occasional entertainment, now became an organic necessity. The symbol of all this was the Colosseum, which had been built in the 1st century. It could hold up to 50,000 people, and it seldom stood empty. Under the Republic, there had been 65 days of games a year. Their number increased steadily until by the 4th century they took up 175 days, half the year. The circus is their temple, said a contemporary observer. Bread, however, ran out long before the circuses. It, too, had changed from an occasional handout to a regular aspect of public assistance designed to mollify the urban crowd. There was free wine, free grain, oil, bacon, even money. There might be handouts equivalent to $10 or $15 or even $20 to 300,000 people or more. If the state was going to pay for all this, someone had to pay the state. Obviously, that would be the provinces, the producers, the rural population. This led to growing resentment of all those greedy, useless mouths in the city, or else it meant an attempt to join the useless mouths, who at least had some fun, to become a consumer rather than a producer. And this, of course, meant fewer producers and still more problems.
The cost of large-scale public assistance did not matter so much when the economy was reasonably stable. But when it was disrupted by civil war after the 2nd century and by foreign invasions after the 3rd, such burdens became serious. As the economy began to crack in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the emperors concentrated on squeezing all the money and the goods they could in order to pay the army, or else to pay the barbarians whom the army no longer held in check. Now this meant that the economy entered a vicious downward spiral, and society with it. There were ever heavier taxes, ever fewer people capable of paying taxes. Inflation and debasement of the currency drove gold and silver out of circulation. Taxes were increasingly paid in kind, in grain, in cattle, in forced labor, or else they weren't paid at all. The economy, which had taken centuries to shift from barter to cash, slipped back to the primitive level of barter. And so this was another factor in the decline of Rome.
There was, however, one problem which was basic to Hellenistic society in general and to the later Roman Empire in particular. The cities consumed without producing. As you might guess from this well-stocked bread shop in Pompeii, the cities ate up what the countryside produced, and they left little for the peasants who grew increasingly desperate. This situation became more serious as barbarian pressure increased, and with it, economic pressure on the countryside became harder and harder to bear.
So great as the empire was, it was economically anemic. There was little industrial production, there was little investment in enterprises that would increase the quantity of available goods and money and set them circulating. And this is one of the great differences between ancient and modern economies. Ancient capital, unlike modern capital, went either into buying land or else into usury, which is the lending out of money at extremely high interest rates. And there was little interest in new possibilities for technological change because production was generally limited to domestic economy, to what an individual home or estate needed, or else to luxury goods.
The principal cause of ruin, however, was probably hypertrophy, growing too big, which is the essential sickness of every ancient empire. A state grows, it eliminates one threat after another, it gobbles up competitors, and after a while the sheer cost of army and administration proves too much for the economy. According to another view, it was too heavy taxes that drove people off the land, and so the decay of agriculture was the result of tax burdens. So it can be argued that the Roman Empire, which had been built in the first place by the Roman legions and the Roman farmers who fought in them, was bound to fall to pieces when the small independent farmer was extinct and the legions decayed partly for lack of him. To understand why that happened, we have to keep in mind that the Roman Empire had never possessed a really homogeneous culture. After it spread out of Italy, the empire was an artificial union of alien social organisms which had been largely brought together by an amazing effort of military and administrative organization. But it was a shotgun marriage, not a love match. Although there was a community of culture between cities, the Hellenistic cities of the East and the Latin cities of the West, this unity was superficial and it was mostly limited to a privileged class. It was a society of consumers based on slave labor and on the exploitation of subject classes and subject people. As soon as this privileged class was ruined by the economic crisis of the 3rd century and by the loss of its political privileges, the underlying differences between the eastern and western parts of the empire emerged as strong as ever.
Which is not meant to suggest that the society was bad, but just that it wasn't flexible. It was not structured or equipped to adjust, to expand its means to the scale of its needs. And so when it had to adjust, all it could think of was to try to freeze things in place, or to make them worse, tax more, control more, enforce and coerce and restrain, as we shall see next time.